Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As many of you have followed our program over the years, you realize that one of the themes we really enjoy about our show is our green and sustainable lifestyle shows that we like to talk about. Most people will follow certain procedures if they watch YouTube to figure out how they can go about doing this depending on the setting that they're in. Perhaps you're somebody who lives in an urban setting. For instance, an apartment in downtown Manhattan, New York, trying to figure out how you could use that space to actually get that kind of sustainability that we're talking about. Or maybe you got a little bit of land and you're somewhere just on the outstretches on the edge of the city, or perhaps even deeper into the countryside. The question is, how does one get started? Well, on the program today, we're going to be talking about how we can be able to grow a sustainable backyard meadow. Well, maybe you might be able to do that inside of a small apartment, but if not, well, at least if you have a little bit of a plot of land, we can figure out how we can do that. On our program, we're joined by somebody who actually has been able to teach at the university as well as college level about holistic health studies and nutritional science. And she's going to be joining us to share the process that she reconnected with her Native American heritage by learning the wisdom of the medicinal wheel and its teachings. Her story is one of partnership with the land and a discovery and love of nature. She teaches that the garden's path offers a way to remember and to be with a person's self in stillness, meandering onto unknown pathways that can twist and turn but are filled with such beauty. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest and author of the book, At the Garden's Gate, Growing a Sustainable Backyard Meadow, our guest, Judith Dreyer. Judith, thank you for being on the program today.
Thank you, Dan. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, it's pretty exciting when people try to reconnect. I mean, they take their days off from work to get out of the harried worlds, and they figure, a nice walk to the park, or if they can get out and actually listen to the trees, will actually kind of cleanse their mind and perhaps reinvigorate their soul. But what is it that people are really trying to do here that you discovered, especially from your own personal, journey?
I think we realize that there's a lot of problems out there. There's a lot of problems with how we've managed our natural landscapes. So at the Garden's Gate, I sought to create a doorway, a portal, some kind of different perspective so that we can change our relationship to nature. You have to realize we come from a military type of paradigm and history, and that includes command, conquer, and control, right? And that uses up our resources. It feeds the bottom line regardless of consequences. And what we're seeing today is the consequences of our actions. So what I'm hoping to get across is that it's really time for us to have profound inner change. And I think wanting to be in nature, stepping back out into nature in some fashion, whether it's an hour a week on a hike or whether we dig in the dirt in our own backyard, nature changes us if we allow it to, if we open the door, if we open the gate to working with nature differently.
Now, Ed, you have written a book called At the Garden's Gate. Let's talk about what the overall theme of your book exactly is. I mean, I know we've touched on it a little bit, but kind of give us some insight about that.
Well, I wanted it to be different. There's a lot of herbal books out there. There's a lot of books out there about wild edibles. And I wanted to have a different focus, a different way of conveying information that not only gave facts, but also touched our hearts in some way. So I came up with the idea of the gate, a garden's gate. It's a way to step through into another pathway, so to speak. We can use it very metaphorically as well as very practically. So if it's time for an interchange and it's time for a shift, then the Garden's Gate is a way for us to have a deeper meaning, a more profound connection, but it's also a beautiful way, a fun way to help us on this journey of respecting nature differently. So in my travels, I started to learn from my Native American elders. I learned the medicine wheel, and I found the wheel to be especially profound for living life. So I decided to combine my love of the wild edibles and what these very simple plants offer us in our landscape, often considered weeds, often terribly zapped with synthetic fertilizer, chemicals and pesticides, herbicides, that really contribute a lot to our health and healing, but we've forgotten how to use them. And we've forgotten how important that they are to us as a human being on this planet. My native elders taught me that everything we need is in our backyard, and it's under our feet as well. So what I decided to do was to look at the medicine wheel, look at the teachings on the wheel, and pair that up with plants. And these are plants that are found very easily in our landscape. And they're also medicinal and edible in their properties. And that became a teaching tool. So I decided to use the medicine wheel as a teaching tool for the plants. And my desire and hope is that the reader will, say, read about a place on the wheel, and for some reason that will connect with them. The teaching will connect with them, and hopefully they can make the connection to a specific plant. And all we have to do is start with one plant. Not everybody in our community is supposed to be the healer or the herbalist or the doctor. We need our carpenters, and we need our plumbers, and we need our tech people. But those who are drawn to understanding the natural world, this is a way of teaching. And actually, I feel it's similar to the way native elders would teach. They would tell you a story first, they would give you a teaching first, and let you extrapolate, the truth for yourself. So I was hoping, and I still hope, that my book meets that need and creates that model for learning. And then I put in there a very practical section on how to take a landscape. It could be 2 feet wide, it could be a whole half an acre, into some form of a meadowland or a more natural landscape. And my deep desire is to encourage people to reduce the use of lawn and to increase a more natural landscape, because we've lost at least 45% of our bugs globally. We're losing biodiversity within all species. We've created deserts across our planet. We've lost a third of our topsoil in just a short 100 years. And this is not to mention how much carbon's in the atmosphere that's creating climate change, climate warming. And we have about 7 to 9 billion people on the planet, and we all need clean food, water, healthy soils, and air. So maybe by looking at our own personal landscapes, we can make a difference.
I really couldn't agree with you more. We began doing a series of shows back in the, almost going into the mid-late part of 2000, about a particular series of books that was written, starting with the first one called Anastasia, a story about a little girl who was found in the forest of the taiga, which is in Russia. And the whole theme of the book was about natural laws and the power that man has actually surrendered in many ways due to technology and the disconnection that we've had as a result of that, and what we have actually lost. And you're really touching on some of this here today. And what's fascinating is that people tend to think, well, you guys are talking about that hippie movement stuff. Oh, really, that's just beneath you, really reconnecting with the land is just, so you'd rather just be disconnected, and shopping is more important, and getting that next cell phone and becoming even more disconnected because you got to play on that, wondering who's trying to connect with you at your convenience, these sort of things. And you realize how devastating this can become. Now, that being said, let's get back to what you're talking about at your book, At the Garden's Gate, with people, for instance, who may have a house that has that yard. First of all, it's kind of funny to see all these green yards and how useless they actually are. Now, to give you an idea, my wife's family lives just right outside the suburbs of Chicago, Illinois. Her father loves gardening, and it's really fascinating to go into their neighborhood. You see that all the houses there look the same. All the yards in this neighborhood, when you look down the street there, they all have that same lawn. His is the only yard that doesn't. What you see are trenches with kale of purple and green coming up, and just all these different plants. And then in the backyard, it's even more phenomenal. And to give you an idea, the front yard couldn't be any bigger than, let's say, maybe 15 by 20 feet. And then in the backyard, at best, maybe 30 by 30. That's not very big. That's not a whole lot of land. Now, in the back, it's even more abundant when it comes to things like growing, let's say, edible plants and so forth. Even more astounding is the diversity of life that surrounds that house. Rabbits coming into the yard. I mean, when I first went to see them and to visit with them, we went to get out of the car, and it was at night. And I said, "What's this animal in this cage?" And he just kind of, off the cuff, he says, I don't know, it could be a skunk. Well, the fact was that's exactly what it was. And what he does is he has these traps that he sets in his yard where the animals get caught, and then he actually takes them out to a park and releases them. And it happened to be a skunk. He was standing there the next day feeding the skunk in this cage and making this connection with him. When you think of a skunk, you think about getting blasted or, whatever. And he says, no, it's not like that. And he went on to talk to me about how the animal works and when you get sprayed, what happens that makes that occur. And here I stepped out of the car that night right next to the cage, and here was a skunk, kind of a thing. But it was just astounding to see all the life that was happening around, from what he did, and the feeling of aliveness of this yard. So it isn't just about possibly growing food, for the sake of your garden in the yard, but it's what you attract to it. And it was just very invigorating just to sit in his yard and to see. You could just see and feel the energy. What do you say about that?
Well, I think you're right on so many levels. We've actually created a term, scientific term, for the soil that we put our hands into. It's called geosmin. That actually, when we breathe it in, gives us a sense of pleasure, of calmness and relaxing. So gardeners know this. When people who love to garden dig in the dirt, and they do feel a sense of peace. Secondly, what your father-in-law did was create a beautiful, diverse landscape that, of course, would attract so many critters on all different levels into that land space. It's pretty incredible. And the fact is that he could teach you and maybe others in the neighborhood to not be afraid of that skunk, who really doesn't want to harm us. The skunk does not want to harm us, but they have a role in the ecosystem. And why shouldn't they be allowed some chance to have their place in there? And that's, I think, a connecting piece that we grossly overlook. We don't like a bug, we don't like a critter, let's get rid of it. That's really been our mentality. And unfortunately, they're suffering big time. And if they suffer, we are going to suffer. So creating a diverse landscape in a neighborhood can be a role model. It can be habitat. And he can make a difference just in that one community by being brave and bold enough to convert a front yard and a backyard into a diverse landscape.
Now, I know that in your book you also write about wild edibles and weeds, and I'd like to touch on that because, again, I like to share personal experiences, and hopefully as the listeners are listening, they'll begin to see this isn't some crazy, I shouldn't even use that word, the idea of the hippie movement, because it isn't that. It's about reconnecting for everybody, wherever you may be. Now, I was taking a walk to the store one time after reading a book about wild weeds, if you will, and what they're out there, what they're all about. In fact, this particular individual was really giving you the essence, in other words, as if the plant was talking to you about who they are. Well, you can find me, for instance, in this setting, that sort of a thing. And eventually talking about, well, this is, if you were to use this weed, what it might do for your health, for instance. One of the weeds I remember reading about was the chickweed. And I was really astounded to realize just how you find this pretty much everywhere. If you have a gravel driveway or even in cracked cement places, for instance, those abandoned parking lots, how you see this thing just everywhere, this matted weed that strings out, with these little leaves. But anyway, back to walking to the store. The store walk was usually about just over a quarter of a mile, some of it even uphill. And as I was out there kind of looking for these weeds and these plants just to see if I could identify them on the way there, I realized my walk took me almost, it seemed like a minute versus if I was just intentionally walking to the store, it felt like, maybe 20 minutes to a half hour or something like that. Because I felt that I was lost in this world of reverie just simply trying to identify, I was actually taking my mind out of what my intention was to enjoy what was around me and become curious. Now, that's something people should consider, shouldn't they?
I agree. That's called being in the moment, and nature's right there for us to pay attention to. And it has much to teach us. And like you said, by staying in the moment, we get out of our monkey mind. We get out of our daily mental thoughts that, keep us in the future or keep us in the past. And being in the moment is the basis of, I think, most every tradition on the planet, staying somehow in the moment, appreciating what's around us. And that's what you have felt and experienced on your walk.
Now, you were, as you were saying earlier in the program, very inspired by Native American elders. Let's talk about your journey with them and how that inspired you.
Well, that's an interesting journey. You know how life is. One thing leads to another, and it's not linear. Things happen when they're supposed to happen. So the first thing I wanted to share is that when I was little, if I was not behaving or listening correctly, my mom would often say to me and my brother, if you don't behave, I'm going to sell you back to the Indians for 2 cents and a collar button. And as a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, I was like frightened, like, who were these people? And I wanted to see them. But we never quite made it down to the end of the stairs because we agreed to behave. So we never quite got to see who this Indian chief was. But as I got older, folks started to say that I looked Native American, and my mother's great-grandmother was Native American, and so she has the oral tradition of that being passed down to us. Unfortunately, in her time, in my mother's time, Native Americans were not seen in a positive light, so they often hid some of the stories. They wouldn't pass some of the stories down. So that became a quest of mine. At the same time, I was about 5 years old. I had the first dream that I really vividly remember, even to this day, and it was a spider dream, and I was away from my parents. I had gone with my aunt and uncle that I knew, and I went to their home, and they were far away from us. We had a long car trip, and they lived in my uncle was at the time in the Air Force, so they lived in a trailer off the Air Force base, and I was put in a small bunk bed in the trailer, and I actually had an awakened dream, which I had no idea what that was about at that point in my life. How could I? But I remember being awake within the bunk I was sleeping in, but the inside of my bunk bed, the covers, the pillow, the ceiling, the walls were covered with spiders. And, of course, I woke up frightened. And my aunt came in, and she turned on all the lights, and there was no spiders there, and that was the end of the story. Years later, I found out through somebody else's story what that spider dream actually meant for me, and they were actually comforting me that I was not alone, but I had absolutely no awareness of that. So when I got older, I really wanted to know more about my Native American ancestry. It was like a passion of mine to find them. So one step led to another step. A book led to an event, a person, that kind of thing. And eventually, I went to my first herbal conference, which was the Green Nations Gathering back in 1989, and I met Grandmother Twyla, who was the matriarch of the Seneca Nation, and the Seneca Nation is in western New York. And she and I sat next to each other, and we started talking, and I ended up meeting a gentleman who was her apprentice, and he gave me the advice for the following year to go to the Women's Council. and Twyla was not going to be traveling anymore due to her age, and I could meet with her and go to the council and take some beginning steps, which I did. And it was actually a very profound event for me in so many ways and on so many levels. First of all, dreaming is accepted there. So to talk about dreams, people would look at me and say, yeah, so what, everybody dreams. But in my world, in Western society, in the typical suburban neighborhood, nobody talked about dreams because we weren't taught that. Nobody talked about dreams in my family growing up. So that was a big draw for me, to try to find people who could help me understand the dream time and the dreaming that I was doing. And secondly, I was deeply passionate about learning about wild edibles. So again, at the Women's Council, I could meet up with like minds and like hearts, people who would go out on walks, we would share the knowledge of what plants we learned, so forth and so on. And what was so, I think, profound about it was, here I am, I drove up in my horse-powered car with my tent, and there were about 80 of us at this event, and we set up all of our tents around Grandmother Twyla's teaching log. And I looked around, and I said, boy, we've come a long way. Instead of being on horse and buggy with a travois carrying our gear, we now have horsepower that gets us here from all over the world in a very easy way. So that was the fun part of stepping into a more formal ceremony and part of their tradition. The Women's Council, I don't believe, happens anymore. I met another one of my teachers there. She ended up moving to Connecticut. We ended up having a journey together. But the bottom line for working with the Native elders was learning this medicine wheel. And I didn't learn about the plants from my elders. What I learned was the wheel. And by working with this medicine wheel, I was able to guide myself into my own learning about the plants, about nature, about biodiversity, about meadows. And it really became a foundation, not just for the outside world of doing those things, but also my inside world of my own growth and development. So again, if we go into the Native community, there's nuggets there that I think are just so worthwhile. And I taught for over 13 years at a local university, and I would share this with my students, and I had a module specifically on Western herbology to open their eyes and their hearts to the fact that these very simple plants in our landscape have a lot to offer. And I can't tell you how many times they would come back to me and say they didn't know, and how excited they were to open their own knowledge base and not be afraid of using some of these simple plants. So if we get back to the Native American kind of, philosophy, Dan, their foundation, you've heard this, I'm sure, with all your guests on your show. First, take care of the earth. What we need is under our feet. What we do affects the next 7 generations. Be grateful for everything. And I learned, and I talk about this in my book, I went out with cornmeal or tobacco nearly every day that I worked this land space, and I gave thanks. I said thank you to the plants, thank you to the critters, thank you for creation that was there. And again, an underlying theme, and not just the Native American philosophy, but any of the models and traditions on this planet all go back to nature. We, as a human being, are the microcosm for the universe around us. That's the macrocosm. What happens in me happens in the universe. What happens in the universe happens in me. We're really not separated. It's just difficult sometimes for us to take the pieces apart and then apply them, and then we can start understanding the holistic model that really exists here within ourselves as well as in the natural world.
As you were talking about dreams, especially the spiders and the spider webs, and how we don't seem to talk too much about dreams and dreaming, I always find it fascinating when you do open that conversation how many people really want to participate in it, first of all.
Right.
So apparently we all dream a lot more than we think we do. That being said, I know that you talk about plant spirits in your book. Now, putting those two things together, I remember a time back in the early 90s as I first had the wonderful opportunity to meet and interview anthropologist Wade Davis. Some people might be familiar with his work when it comes to the book which became a Wes Craven movie called The Serpent and the Rainbow. But there were many other short stories as well as books that he's produced, obviously, since then. And during one of the books or stories that I was reading about, as he was talking about destruction of the earth, for instance, the rubber tree plant, I began thinking, it was almost like something hit me as I was reading this work here, and I thought to myself, just imagine the indigenous cultures in areas such as Borneo or the Amazon rain basin or, for instance, the Congo jungle. I mean, these are places that are very rich, extremely diverse when it comes to plant life, to the point you can actually get lost for a lifetime if you happen to be here. And I thought to myself how these indigenous people must have discovered the particular plants they did find, for example, for medicinal uses. And it was funny how it came to me. I thought, they initiate a shaman who actually is someone who is the tribal seer, if you will. This is the person that helps to manage the spirits or the spirit of the community, helps to heal the community should they become sick, people within the group there. And the conclusion I had came with, and it was literally like it just came to me in a dream, was these plants must come to them in a dream through their spirit. Because when you think about how hard it would be to find some of these things they've been able to find, you couldn't even get a college-trained professor in botany, for instance, to find a lot of these things. And here they were coming naturally with no formal education. And to me, it almost seems like what you're talking about here, especially in your book At the Garden's Gate, is probably that phenomenon, wouldn't it be?
Well, I agree with you. First of all, we don't want to talk about the fact that we are a multidimensional species. And the world is multidimensional. We have taken our mind and made it very logical, very, if it's not proved scientifically, it doesn't exist. And that's only a small portion of this world. Most of the world knows better than that. So talking about plant spirits, for example, is still a touchy and a tricky subject simply because it's not easily measurable. It's elusive, and it's a very deeply personal experience. So the ones that really get this are the ones that experience it on some level for themselves. So, for example, if we do something very simple like talk about intuition, talk about a gut reaction, most people can understand things on that level. So, you're driving down the freeway and you just had this gut feeling to turn right instead of left, and you find out there was a traffic jam if you had gone left. We get validation for that kind of knowing through those kinds of experiences. If we want to go a step further and go into the realms of energy and the metaphysics of our world, then we have to study a little differently. We have to train ourselves to listen a little differently, because as my native elder said, we're not just listening with our external ears, we have to listen with our internal ears. It's not just our visual sight for the outside world, but it's our inner sight that's just as valid. The problem is we simply haven't been trained on those levels very easily in our society, and unfortunately there's still been a stigma to it based on our Judeo-Christian medical models, our religious models, say that, we can't possibly know that, but yet if you step outside of those models, of course we can, and we do. So the point of the whole thing is, the shamans of old were deeply trained. They were taught to listen to the physical world differently. They were thought to use their eyes and their ears and their senses on an inner level very differently. And those trainings were not easy. I myself am a trained shamanic dreamer, and it takes a lot of diligent effort to work with the system, but they were trained at it, and they were the ones who were considered the healers. And yes, they had inner experiences meeting up with plant spirits that gave them direction, and miracles happened, and that's in the literature. It's in the stories. It's always been with us. It's just once we started to get away from I think it's more when we stepped into more of the Descartes type of thinking, the rational mind, we separated ourselves out from that kind of knowing.
Now, earlier in the program, I was talking about a meadow, and this is something you also talk about, especially within your work as well as your book. Now, I remember, or you were talking about how, as you began to do this, you had mentioned mistakes that you felt that you had made in working with your backyard and nature. Let's talk about that a little bit and what you learned or why that was significant that you had those mistakes in the first place.
Well, again, it's called learning. I put myself out there to learn about the meadow. And I had a very typical suburban backyard. We had just under an acre of land in suburbia in Connecticut, and I looked at my backyard and saw that I had a variety of plants there and decided to let them grow. And in doing so, I ended up putting paths in there, and I just allowed the land to teach me. And I came across a couple of areas that spoke deeply about plant spirits, and one of which was Findhorn, which you know about. It's in Scotland, and they were founded by people who listened to the plant spirits, or the devas, as they're called, devas. And, if they wanted to do something with the tomato plant, they connected with the tomato plant spirit or the tomato deva to get information or understanding of where to plant it in their garden. And I've never had the privilege or opportunity of visiting Findhorn, but from what I understand, it's a very scruffy land. It's in the north coast of Scotland, so you're talking about some harsh conditions, and yet this garden flourishes, and it's absolutely beautiful. Not only that, but very learned people from all over the plant world, around the world, visit there and have documented what they see. So there is some documentation, so to speak, for this kind of work. So in their system, I came across some of their channelings from the plant spirit world, and I came across a particular message that said, they will tolerate our mistakes up to a point. And again, it's our intention. What is our intention in working with them? So here I am, busy working out my meadow every day, and in the summertime I was always out there. I was always watching and looking and sitting in the stillness. I was gathering, I was harvesting, and I gave thanks, and I acknowledged them, and my intention was to learn from them. I was married at the time with 2 children, and I tried my best to teach them as much as I could. But in our society, a lot of folks think this is woo-woo stuff, especially when I was doing it. It wasn't part of our internet yet. We didn't have the internet the way we do today to connect people with like mind and like heart. So I had created a meadow, and the kids wanted a little bit more room to play ball and that kind of thing. And my ex-husband very much wanted to give them that. And I made the mistake of not going out and warning the presences there that they were going to be mowed down. And before I knew it, it was mowed. And I went out there, and I personally felt a tremendous sadness. And I couldn't figure out why I was feeling such a sadness. But the more I walked around it and I saw that it was cut, I realized that I hadn't warned the presences there that this was going to happen. And I synchronistically got confirmation for this through Doreen Virtue's work. She was writing about plant spirits at the same time, and she had an experience of mowing the lawn and realizing the presences that were there that we just inadvertently chop up, mow, cut down without any thought that there's a presence there. And so I felt it was important for me to sort of stick my neck out, if you will, and write about this in my book, because it was real to me, and the people that work in this way, it's real to them. And there's a very deep ancient message that says everything has a soul. If we have a soul, everything in nature has a soul. And you can translate that to however you want. But that tells me that there's a life force there that's maybe different from ours, but it doesn't mean it should be discounted just because it's different. And so, by observation, by sitting still, by working with them, by paying attention, by using my inner senses, I came to have a great deal of sense and feeling within my land space on many levels. And that, to me, was a very profound shift in my own understanding of nature.
Wow, it's amazing how much you can actually learn, huh?
It is. It absolutely is. If we just say, yes, I'm ready.
Mm-hmm. Now, back earlier I was also talking about wild edibles and weeds, and you actually, through your book, teach this with the use of a medicine wheel. Talk about this system of truths and the pairing and the teachings with plants.
Okay, so the medicine wheel, Grandmother Twyla's mother was blind, and she was considered a medicine person in their tribe. And when Twyla came along, she knew Twyla was going to be a voice between their world and our world, the Native American world and Western world. And they created a tool to sort of get this out into the world. And their inspiration and their guidance showed them the face of a clock. So they put the teachings, you know, number 1 has a teaching, number 2 has a teaching, and of course 13 is the center. And the center is where we run everything through our own truth. So that's kind of the basis of a medicine wheel. All indigenous cultures have some kind of wheel where they honor the 4 directions in some fashion, north, south, east, and west. So again, in my book, I talk about what the directions mean to me. What have I learned about the directions? And that's what my elder taught me to do. She said, it's up to you to put your own wisdom onto the wheel. So I take that learning, and then I applied it to the plants. So let's look at number 1. I think that's a great place to start. Number 1 is learn the truth. So what does learning the truth mean to you? What does it mean to learn the truth about something? It means getting a foundation in some way. It means knowledge is power. It means knowing something so that we can move forward more completely or more full or actually mindful of what to do next. So learning the truth is really rich, and it's a great place to begin. So I chose a very common plant in our lawns, the plantain plant. This is Plantago major and lanceata. This is not the banana plantain. That's an entirely different plant. It doesn't grow here in the Northeast. That's more tropical. But the plantain is in our lawns, and plantain is thought as a weed. There's a lot of garden chemicals to try to get rid of it. It's a very hardy plant, and it often shows up where we walk on compacted soil, and that's because it's trying to hold the soil together. So learning the truth actually has beginning steps. So I talk a lot about my use of the plant in my family. It's a Band-Aid plant. It's the first plant that herbalists learn about. So here we are, have a teaching, learning the truth, and the first plant there is plantain, which we all learn about initially in our herbal studies because it's the first line of defense. So you can see the thread that I'm trying to create here with this system of learning about the plant. So I relate in my story a couple of areas where it's extremely helpful. You know, I was walking with a thin pair of socks. I must have walked 2 miles. I came home with blisters on the bottom of my heels, which is a very awkward place to have blisters because you have to walk on them. But I got out my books. I had plantain brewing. I put some oil on it. I put plantain leaves in between my socks and my feet during the day, and I never had a problem with the soreness or burning of a blister that would break. The water was completely deflated in the blisters, and I never had any issue or pain, and eventually they healed. And I was amazed at that kind of lesson. And then my son fell and completely smashed his face driving his bike on a gravel road. And so we cleaned everything off, and we put the oil and the salve that I make, under all the scrapes and bruises, but he wouldn't let me put it underneath his nose. So I let him experience this, and everything cleared up on his face within a few days. It was really pretty cool. But he noticed the one on the top of his lip, under his nose, didn't. So he finally said to me, "Okay, Mom, put the salve there." And so he learned through experience that this really does work. So again, when we get to the plants and their rich gifts, sometimes we have to learn by doing. We have to learn through experience. And as I said previously, not everybody in our community is going to be the herbalist or going to be the healer. So luckily, we can have people make products, so we don't have to do the research, but we can understand and use the particular plant for its usage. But also under learning the truth are the beginning steps for learning about plants. There are some rules that are very, very important, one of which is don't taste a plant that you have no idea what it is. I mean, that's just a common sense rule. Use at least 3 to 5 field guides to identify a plant. Leaves can be very deceptive. There can be common names that are the same but entirely different plants. So you really have to be diligent and observant in learning about the plant, and then you can verify that. I used to verify any new plant for me was when I would go to Herb Walks or Herb Talks, and I would ask people who are more experienced than myself, is this what this plant is? And I would get validation, yes or no. So those are some of the ways that I teach using the wheel and pairing up the plant.
Wow, and there's so much to gain from all of this. It sounds like, what our listeners should be doing is finding a way that they can get a hold of your book to get started if this is a journey they decide they want to take, which I encourage everybody to. For instance, going back to weeds, I remember that I had a backyard full of dandelions. Now, this here is one of those plants that basically has gotten a very, very, very bad rap. And now what's funny is you see commonly in grocery stores now, dandelions for sale. We've all of a sudden decided, hey, this is something we didn't know does this, and it becomes beneficial as part of our diet. But even more so, as I understood, there was a person we had on the program talking about sustainable farming, and much like you in many ways, she likes to reach in for the understanding or the meaning or what, for instance, plants or animals are really trying to tell you, what their part is. And she says the dandelion is actually a plant that finds itself growing to replace, I guess it's potassium or something like that, back into the soil. So here's a plant that grows for the specific reason of giving something back. And in return, for those who aren't familiar, the dandelion with the little flower that comes up and you get to blow the little white things into the air is also a plant that you can use for cleansing the liver. And when you look at this, and here we're out on this destructive path, as though there is a war, sort of like the war on cancer, there's a war on dandelions, and Roundup and DuPont are going to make sure that you're part of that solution. And it's like, are you out of your mind?
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, that's the mentality we've created, and our media supports that because, the corporate bottom line is more important than sustainability. And that's what I'm hoping to change with my book and other things that I do, is to change the mindset. Go through the gate of your own awareness. See what needs to be pulled out, what weeds need to be pulled out, and what can you replant that's more sustainable. So that's a very good example is the dandelion. People don't even realize. I talk a lot to garden clubs, to various organizations, and the dandelion is the first food, or one of the first foods that the pollinators need in the springtime, and it's also one of the last foods that they can eat and get nourishment from in the fall. Not to mention, every part of the plant can be used, and it's considered a tonic plant. So we can actually drink 2 cups of dandelion leaf tea if we wanted to every day, and we'd be fine. We could make roasted dandelion root. We can take the blossoms and throw it in our pancakes and in our quiches. There's actually a website that has 180 recipes for using dandelion, which I think is, just great fun out there that this tool that we've created, the World Wide Web, gets us information so easily today. And that's a gift. It's a gift for our learning.
Absolutely. Well, Judith, thank you so much for being on the program today to share with us wonderful knowledge for our listeners to feel encouraged to at least think about or consider or take that first step toward getting back and becoming reconnected. I believe a lot of it is because of our disconnection in nature that we have really found ourselves with more sickness and illness and frustration and anxiety. And making that simple change to go back, I guess, to the garden, if you will, is one of those things that you can reap immediate benefits and find that sense of soothing calm that I think we were really meant to experience. Is there a website people can find out more about your work and how they can get your book, things like that?
Oh, there is. Can I just make one comment? We forget that nature's wild, and we have a wildness to our nature. And I don't know why we're afraid of it, but being in the wild, it's a little bit messy. It's not linear. There's parts of nature that don't appear to be manicured and pretty, but it's those parts that feed us. And I'd love to leave the listeners with that kind of an idea. And also, Janine Benyus from the Biomimicry Institute, she says something very beautifully. There's a hidden unity in nature. We are part of a confident universe surrounded by genius. And as a species, we're very young. It's time for us to remember that we are but apprentices to these masters in our natural world. So, yes, getting back to the website, it's www.judithdreyer.com, and that's JUDITHDRE, that's D as in Dan, DREYER.com. My book and my classes, my podcast series, all things are listed there and easily referenced. My book is also available on various platforms such as Amazon, Goodreads, Kobe, name a few.
Well, it sounds like I can find you just about anywhere then.
Yes, it's on several platforms. Mm-hmm.
Very good. Well, Judith, thank you so much for being on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you, Dan. I'm delighted to be here. I wish you only the best.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Discover yourself and discover our shows and the future that's ahead at your fingertips. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.